My children and their spouses spent 3 years trying to convince me my beloved Victorian home was too much to manage, and I needed to sign it over to them. But when I discovered they'd already been showing my house to realtors behind my back, I sold my family home of 45 years to a lovely young stranger for half its market value and disappeared from their lives without a forwarding address. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I never imagined spending my 70s starting life over in a new town without the family photos, heirlooms, and memories that had surrounded me for decades. At 73, I had envisioned aging peacefully in the home where I'd raised my family, tending my garden, hosting Sunday dinners for my grandchildren, and perhaps finally cataloging the extensive collection of local historical documents my late husband and I had accumulated over our 47 years of marriage. Instead, I found myself at the center of a family dynamic that had gradually, almost imperceptibly, transformed from concern to control, from support to surveillance, from love to avarice, a dynamic I never agreed to and eventually had to escape entirely. My name is Margaret Whitley. I raised 3 children in our family home in the small college town of Riverview, where my late husband James and I settled after he accepted a position as a history professor at Riverview College in 1975. Our Victorian house with its wraparound porch, original stained glass windows, and sprawling oak-shaded garden had stood for over a century before we purchased it, and we spent decades lovingly restoring its period details while raising our family within its solid brick walls. We purchased the house for what seemed an astronomical sum at the time, nearly all our savings and a mortgage that stretched our young professor's salary to its limits. The real estate agent had warned us about the extensive repairs needed: the leaking roof, the outdated electrical system, the crumbling plaster in several rooms. But when James and I stepped into the grand entryway with its carved wooden staircase, ascending to a stained glass landing window, we both knew immediately this was where our future would unfold. "This isn't just a house, Maggie," James had whispered, his voice echoing in the empty foyer. "It's a piece of living history." The town of Riverview wraps around a bend in the Silverdale River, the Victorian and colonial homes of its historic district climbing the gentle hill that overlooks the college campus. Even now, Riverview remains the kind of place where the local bookstore hosts poetry readings every Thursday evening, where the farmers market features produce from farms that have been family-owned for generations, and where the annual Founders Day Festival still includes historical reenactments that James helped research and authenticate. When we chose this town, we were drawn to its intellectual energy balanced with small-town connectedness, believing it was the ideal place to pursue academic interests while raising children with community values. Our house sat on Maple Avenue, 3 blocks from the college, and a short walk from the town library where I would eventually work. Built in 1887 by Harold Prescott, a local lumber baron, it featured the ornate woodwork and distinctive turret typical of the Victorian era. The previous owners had been an elderly couple who had lived there for 40 years but could no longer manage the stairs. They sold it to us with tears in their eyes, extracting a promise that we would preserve its historical character rather than subdividing it into student apartments as developers had proposed. A house becomes a home through the stories it witnesses. "Maggie," James used to say, his eyes crinkling at the corners as he carefully restored another section of original woodwork. "We're not just preserving this building, we're preserving its soul." He was a contemplative man, my husband, methodical and thorough from his years of historical research, but with a poetic sensibility that emerged in quiet moments. Every Sunday, for decades, he would spend the afternoon working on some aspect of restoration, stripping layers of paint from intricate moldings, carefully repairing plaster medallions around ceiling fixtures, researching historically accurate wallpaper patterns. For the formal parlor, the house became both his passion and his scholarly project, the physical embodiment of the local history he studied professionally. Those early years in the house were challenging but joyful. We lived with plastic sheeting separating habitable rooms from renovation zones. We cooked on a camping stove for 3 months while the kitchen was being restored. We bathed the children in a clawfoot tub that had no shower attachment until James finally installed proper plumbing in the second floor bathroom. Every improvement was carefully researched, every restoration decision considered from both practical and historical perspectives. James found meaning in historical continuity, the careful documentation of Riverview's founding families, including the original owners of our home, the antique furnishings he meticulously researched before acquisition, the local historical society he helped establish in the converted carriage house behind the town library. His favorite evenings were spent in his study, surrounded by primary source documents, connecting threads of local history into meaningful narratives that helped the town understand its own identity. James taught American history at Riverview College for 35 years, becoming department chair and eventually professor emeritus. His specialty was local history and preservation, and generations of students still approach me at community events to share how his passionate teaching influenced their own career choices. Dr. Whitley made me understand that history isn't distant. It's in the buildings we pass every day and the stories behind them, they often tell me. His research focused primarily on how small towns like Riverview contributed to broader historical movements, how local industrialists shaped national economic patterns, how community organizations influenced social reform, how architectural trends reflected changing cultural values. He published 3 books and dozens of scholarly articles, but his most cherished project was the comprehensive history of Riverview that he worked on until his final illness, leaving it nearly completed but unpublished when he died. I met James during my final year of library science studies at the State University. He was a young assistant professor researching in the special collections where I worked part-time. He kept requesting increasingly obscure materials, and I suspected he was more interested in continuing our conversations than in the dusty town records he was allegedly studying. 6 months later, we were engaged, and after our simple wedding, we moved to Riverview, where he had secured a tenure-track position. I worked as the town librarian, eventually becoming director of the Riverview Public Library System. For 28 years, I developed collections, modernized services, and created community programs that turned our library into a cultural hub. My proudest achievement was establishing the Riverview Historical Archives, where James and I collaborated to preserve fragile documents, photographs, and artifacts that told the story of our town's development. The archives began in a corner of the library basement, but eventually expanded to occupy the entire lower level, becoming a respected resource for scholars throughout the region. I specialized in preservation techniques, attending workshops and conferences to learn the latest methods for protecting delicate papers and photographs. Between James's historical knowledge and my archival skills, we rescued countless irreplaceable documents from attics, basements, and abandoned buildings throughout the county. Together, we built a life centered around preservation, education, and community engagement. Our modest professional salaries provided enough for a comfortable life, but not extravagance. We invested our resources in restoring our historical home, educating our children at good universities, and occasionally traveling to research historically significant sites that complemented James's academic work. James and I made a point of visiting at least one historically significant location each summer: Colonial Williamsburg, Sturbridge Village, the Tenement Museum in New York, plantations in the South, mining towns in the West. These weren't luxury vacations but research expeditions, with James taking photographs and notes for his classes, while I typically connected with the archivists and librarians at each site to learn about their preservation methods. Our house evolved as our family grew, each room developing its own character and purpose. The formal parlor housed James's grandmother's piano, where the children took lessons and later practiced for recitals. The library contained floor-to-ceiling bookshelves James built himself, organized by subject matter with a proper card catalog system I implemented. The dining room featured an oak table that seated 16 when fully extended, perfect for the holiday gatherings and academic dinners we regularly hosted. Our home became known for its open door, a place where James's students gathered for end-of-semester discussions, where visiting scholars found temporary lodging in our third-floor guest rooms, where the Historical Society held its annual fundraising, and where our children's friends always found welcome during college breaks. The dining room table had hosted countless Thanksgiving dinners, academic debates, and community planning sessions over the decades. The garden reflected James's interest in historical authenticity as well. He researched the varieties of flowers and herbs that would have been planted during the Victorian era, establishing formal beds bordered by boxwood hedges near the house and a kitchen garden with heritage vegetables behind the garage. My contribution was a cutting garden that provided fresh flowers for the house from spring through fall. We spent countless hours working side by side outdoors, discussing everything from local politics to our children's development while digging, pruning, and planting. Catherine, our eldest, was born in 1976, a serious, organized child who cataloged her book collection by subject and author before she was 10. Even as a young girl, she showed an aptitude for systems and categorization that mirrored my own librarian tendencies. Her bedroom was always immaculate, her schoolwork completed well before deadlines, her extracurricular activities carefully scheduled for maximum achievement. She excelled academically, eventually studying art history at an Ivy League university before pursuing a museum career that combined her organizational skills with her appreciation for cultural artifacts. Robert followed 3 years later, a thoughtful boy with James's analytical mind and my tendency toward community involvement. Where Catherine was structured and precise, Robert was contemplative and philosophical. He spent hours in James's study, asking questions about historical events and their modern implications. His bedroom walls were covered with historical maps and timelines he created himself. In high school, he founded a local history club that documented oral histories from Riverview's oldest residents. Following closely in his father's footsteps, he pursued academia, though in economics rather than history, becoming a tenured professor at a university 2 hours away. Elizabeth arrived 4 years after Robert, our surprise gift with an artistic spirit and passion for architectural preservation that seemed to combine our interests in unexpected ways. From early childhood, she showed remarkable spatial awareness, building elaborate structures with blocks and later creating detailed drawings of buildings she admired around town. While her siblings approached knowledge systematically, Elizabeth understood the world visually and tactilely. She struggled more with traditional academics but flourished in art classes and design projects. Her career in architectural preservation perfectly united her creative talents with our family's commitment to historical stewardship. They filled our home with distinct personalities, occasional scholarly arguments, and the everyday bustle of a family connected to both academics and community that James and I navigated as partners. We weren't perfect parents by any means. James could become so absorbed in his research that he sometimes missed school events. I occasionally imposed library-like standards of quiet that children found restrictive. We argued in front of the children more than modern parenting experts would recommend, though always with respect and intellectual rigor rather than personal attacks. Yet despite our flaws, we created a home where ideas were valued, where history mattered, where community engagement was expected, and where the past was preserved for the benefit of the future. All 3 children absorbed these values, pursuing careers that in different ways reflected the principles James and I had lived by. We were immensely proud of each of them, even as they moved away to establish their own lives and families. James passed away 5 years ago after a brief but aggressive illness. Here, one moment discussing plans for digitizing the Historical Society's photo collection. Gone 8 weeks later, as autumn leaves began to fall on the campus where he had taught. For decades, pancreatic cancer, discovered too late for effective treatment, progressed with a historian's terrible precision through its well-documented stages. leaving us just enough time to say goodbye, but not enough to complete the numerous projects he had planned for his retirement years. The shock and grief of his rapid decline left me unmoored in the life we had built together, surrounded by books, artifacts, and historical documents that both comforted and haunted me. The house that had felt perfectly sized for our active family life and academic pursuits suddenly seemed cavernous, its empty rooms echoing with memories of gatherings now concluded, conversations now silenced, projects now abandoned. For months after the funeral, I moved through our home like a curator in a private museum, touching the historical maps he'd carefully framed for his study, sleeping on my side of the bed while his remained precisely as he'd left it, tending the heritage roses he'd researched and planted to match the varieties originally grown when our house was built. The silence in rooms once filled with his thoughtful lectures and patient explanations felt oppressive, a constant reminder of all that had been lost in those 8 terrible weeks. "Mom, we'll get through this together," Catherine promised as we sorted through James's academic papers in the weeks after the funeral. "You've always been our rock. Now it's our turn to be yours." She stood in his study, carefully organizing manuscript pages into archival boxes. Her efficient movements momentarily paused as she wiped away tears. At 46, Catherine had inherited James's height and my practical nature, combining them with her own driven personality that had made her successful as the administrator of a prestigious museum in Boston. Her husband Thomas, an investment banker whose work-focused personality matched her own, had never quite integrated into our book-loving, historically minded family gatherings despite 20 years of marriage. Their 2 children, 17-year-old Sophia and 15-year-old James, named for his grandfather, reflected the competing influences of wealth-driven ambition from their father and cultural appreciation from their mother. They had returned to their Boston home after the funeral, but Catherine had stayed an extra week to help me begin the overwhelming task of managing James's scholarly legacy. Robert arrived that evening with dinner from the faculty club where his father had been an honored member, along with his wife Rebecca and their 3 children, Emma, who was 16, Charlotte, who was 14, and William, who was 12. At 43, Robert had followed his father into academia, though in economics rather than history, becoming a tenured professor at a university 2 hours away. Rebecca, a pediatrician with a practical approach to both medicine and family, life had always balanced Robert's theoretical tendencies with grounded common sense. Their children reflected this blend, excelling academically while maintaining active social lives and practical hobbies. The family visited frequently, the 3 children having grown up spending part of each summer at our house, while Robert collaborated with colleagues at his father's college. "Dad would want us to preserve his work properly," he said that night, his arm around my shoulders as we looked at the chaotic collection of research materials that had defined James's retirement projects. "To make sure his historical research remains accessible to future scholars." Elizabeth came the following day, driving up from her architectural preservation firm in the city, where she specialized in historical restoration projects. At 39, she had established a growing reputation for her sensitive approach to modernizing historical buildings while maintaining their architectural integrity. Unlike her siblings, whose professional success had been straightforward and expected, Elizabeth had struggled to find her path, working in various design fields before establishing her own firm 6 years earlier. She brought her 11-year-old daughter, Grace, whose father had left shortly after her birth, making them a tight-knit unit that reminded me of the closeness I had shared with each of my children before their adult lives pulled them in different directions. "We'll make this easier for you, Mom," she promised, her eyes, so like James's, swimming with tears. "Whatever you need, whenever you need it. That's what family does." Those words had meant everything during those dark days of early grief. My 3 children, so different in their professional paths yet united in their respect for knowledge and preservation, joined together in their determination to support me. Sunday dinners became a tradition again whenever they could manage, The travel, my grandchildren spent portions of school breaks with me during those first lonely months, and for a time, I felt wrapped in the family embrace James and I had nurtured for decades. The shift happened so gradually, I barely noticed it at first. The weeks following James's funeral established a new rhythm in our household. Catherine returned to Boston after helping organize her father's papers, promising to visit monthly and to assist in finding an academic publisher for his unfinished manuscript on Riverview's history. Robert, living closer, committed to weekly Sunday visits with his family, taking over the garden maintenance that had been James's domain. Elizabeth arranged for her firm's contractors to address several maintenance issues around the house at cost, fixing the leaking spot on the roof that had worried James in his final days, and updating some of the aging electrical outlets to safer modern versions while maintaining their vintage appearance. "We want you to be comfortable and safe here, Mom," Elizabeth explained as she supervised the electrician's work. "Dad would have wanted us to make sure the house he loved so much continues to protect you." Her words resonated with the values James and I had always prioritized: preservation balanced with necessary modernization, historical integrity maintained while adapting to current needs. The improvements were thoughtful and respectful of both the house's character and my preferences, addressing genuine concerns rather than imposing unwanted changes. During those early months, my children's support manifested in practical, meaningful ways. Catherine arranged for her museum's archival department to digitize James's most significant research, ensuring his work would remain accessible even if the fragile original documents deteriorated. Robert brought his children regularly, engaging them in maintaining the garden according to their grandfather's meticulous plans. Elizabeth evaluated the house's structural elements, developing a 5-year maintenance schedule that would prevent major problems while spreading the costs over time. "This place meant everything to Dad," Robert observed one Sunday afternoon as we sat on the porch watching his children weeding the heritage rose bed. "Making sure it stays in good condition is the best way we can honor his memory." I found comfort in their involvement, in the continuity they provided between past and future. The house that had briefly felt oppressively empty began to reclaim its identity as a family gathering place, albeit in a different form than during the active child-raising years. My grandchildren, now adolescents with busy lives of their own, brought youthful energy during their visits, asking questions about family history that kept James's memory alive through stories and traditions. Sophia, Catherine's 17-year-old daughter, showed particular interest in the historical artifacts James had collected. "Grandpa told me each of these objects has its own story," she commented during one visit, carefully examining a Civil War-era letter he had acquired for his research. "I want to learn all of them before they're forgotten." Emma, Robert's eldest, at 16, preferred exploring the garden. "Grandpa showed me how to prune the roses last summer," she recalled, demonstrating the technique he had taught her. "He said some skills need to be passed down directly, not just read about in books." 11-year-old Grace, Elizabeth's daughter, was drawn to the architectural details of the house itself. "Mom says Grandpa could tell which tools made each carving. On the staircase," she told me, running her fingers along the banister he had so carefully restored. "She's teaching me to recognize the different patterns, these connections across generations, the sharing of knowledge, skills, and appreciation that James had valued so highly, helped ease the sharp edges of grief." The children's presence reinforced my sense that although James was gone, his influence continued through the values and interests he had instilled in both his children and grandchildren. Cut to Margaret in the garden, 6 months after James's death. By the 6-month anniversary of James's death, I had established new patterns in my daily life. Mornings were devoted to organizing his papers according to the system Catherine had developed. Afternoons often found me in the garden, maintaining the plantings according to his meticulous records with occasional guidance from Robert. Twice weekly, I volunteered at the Historical Society, continuing our joint project of cataloging Riverview's architectural heritage. Evenings were the most difficult, the time we had typically spent discussing our respective days over dinner, planning future projects, or simply reading companionably in the library. But I had begun filling those hours with correspondence, reading, and occasionally hosting small gatherings of longtime friends. The house no longer felt like a museum to a life that had ended, but rather a living repository of ongoing family history. I found myself appreciating its familiar creaks and settle as the seasons changed, the way afternoon light filtered through the stained glass window on the landing, the smooth patina of the wooden banister worn by thousands of touches over more than a century. The restoration projects James and I had completed together now felt like a tangible legacy, physical embodiments of our shared values and vision. It was during this period of emerging adjustment that the first subtle shift occurred in my children's approach to the house and my place within it. Catherine called on a Tuesday evening, her voice carrying the brisk efficiency that characterized her professional demeanor. "Mom, Thomas and I have been talking about your situation," she began without preamble. "We're concerned about you managing that enormous house all alone, especially with winter coming." The phrasing, "that enormous house," rather than "your home" or "dad's in your house," created a slight distance, as if the property had become an objective problem rather than the center of our family's history. The shift was subtle, but noticeable. The first reframing of my home as a burden rather than a treasure. "I'm managing quite well," I assured her, glancing around the library where I sat surrounded by books James and I had collected over decades. "The maintenance schedule Elizabeth developed is working beautifully, and Robert's help with the garden has kept everything manageable." "But it's so much responsibility," Catherine persisted. "The heating costs alone for those high ceilings must be astronomical. And all those stairs. What if you fell? No one might find you for days." Her concerns weren't entirely unfounded. The house was large for a single occupant. The heating system, though updated over the years, required more fuel than a modern home would. The stairs were many and steep. But these facts had been equally true during the 5 months since James's death, when Catherine had expressed no such worries. "I've lived in this house for over 40 years, Catherine," I reminded her gently. "I know its quirks and requirements intimately, and I have neighbors who check in regularly, plus my volunteer schedule at the Historical Society ensures people would notice my absence." The conversation ended amicably enough, but it marked the beginning of a new narrative about my home and my capabilities. A narrative that would gradually expand and intensify over the coming months. Robert raised similar concerns during his next Sunday visit, though his approach reflected his more analytical personality. "I've been calculating the financial aspects of maintaining this property, Mom," he commented as he helped me prepare lunch in the kitchen. "The property taxes alone are substantial, and they'll likely increase with the new college expansion, raising local real estate values." Again, there was factual truth in his observation. Riverview's growth had indeed raised property values and consequently taxes. But James and I had always managed these costs through careful planning, and my pension combined with his life insurance and retirement funds provided adequate financial security. "We've always budgeted for those increases," I explained, using the plural out of long habit. "And remember that your father and I qualified for the Historical Preservation Tax Credit because of our documented restoration work." Robert nodded, but his expression remained concerned. "That's true, but it only offsets a portion of the cost, and the credit doesn't help with maintenance or utilities. I just worry about these expenses eating into your retirement security over time." Elizabeth's approach was different, reflecting her design sensibility rather than Catherine's efficiency or Robert's analytical perspective. During her next visit, she walked through the house with what I initially thought was professional appreciation but gradually recognized as evaluative assessment. "Have you ever thought about updating the kitchen, Mom?" she asked, eyeing the vintage appliances James and I had carefully selected to complement the house's period while providing modern functionality. We could reconfigure this space to be much more accessible and energy efficient without losing the historical aesthetics. Your father and I considered various options over the years, I responded, remembering the detailed discussions James and I had about each renovation decision. We ultimately chose this configuration because it best preserved the original butler's pantry while accommodating modern needs. Elizabeth nodded, but I noticed her taking measurements and making notes in the small sketchbook she always carried. "I'm just thinking about aging in place," she explained when she caught my questioning look. "Making subtle modifications now that would allow you to remain here comfortably as you get older." Individually, each conversation seemed motivated by genuine concern. Together, they formed the beginning of a pattern, a gentle but persistent questioning of my capability to remain in my own home, a reframing of the house from cherished family heritage to problematic burden, a subtle repositioning of my children from supporters to advisors on decisions I had successfully made independently for decades. By the 9-month mark after James's death, these occasional comments had evolved into regular discussions at family gatherings. A Sunday dinner with all 3 children and their families present became the setting for a more coordinated approach. "We've been discussing options that might make your life easier, Mom," Catherine announced as we finished the main course, exchanging glances with her siblings in a way that suggested prior coordination. "We're all concerned about the long-term sustainability of your living situation." "My living situation seems perfectly sustainable to me," I replied, noticing how they had waited until the grandchildren were occupied with dessert at the far end of the table, creating an adult conversation that excluded me from its preliminary stages. "The thing is, Mom," Robert interjected, his economics professor tone emerging, "we've analyzed the financial implications of maintaining this property versus alternatives that would provide more security and less responsibility for you. And I've researched some wonderful options," Elizabeth added quickly. "There's a new development downtown in those historic commercial buildings I helped renovate. They've created luxury condominiums specifically designed for active seniors who want to remain independent but without home maintenance concerns." The 3 of them continued, presenting what was clearly a prepared case. Catherine emphasized security and community benefits. Robert focused on financial advantages. Elizabeth described architectural features and amenities. Their spouses nodded supportively at appropriate intervals, occasionally adding comments about friends' parents who had made similar transitions and never regretted it. I listened quietly, observing not just their words but the underlying dynamics, the careful coordination, the presentation of the proposal as a conclusion rather than a question, the subtle positioning of themselves as the responsible decision-makers and me as the elderly parent needing guidance, the complete disregard for my deep attachment to the home and what it represented. "This is very thoughtful," I said finally, when their presentation concluded. "But I have no interest in moving. This house isn't simply property to me. It's the physical embodiment of your father's and my life's work. It's where all of you grew up, where your children have formed memories, where our family history resides in every carefully restored detail." Catherine's expression tightened slightly, the same look she'd had as a teenager when her logical arguments failed to persuade me. "Mom, we understand your emotional attachment, but at some point, practicality needs to take precedence over sentiment." "Practicality has always been balanced with preservation in this household," I reminded her. "Your father and I never made decisions about this house based solely on convenience or cost. We considered historical integrity, family needs, and yes, emotional significance too. That balanced approach served us well for over 40 years. Robert leaned forward, adopting the patient tone he likely used with struggling students. "But Dad isn't here anymore, Mom. The equation has changed. You're carrying the burden of this entire property alone now." "It's not a burden," I said firmly. "It's my home. And while I appreciate your concern, this isn't a decision that needs to be made now or in the foreseeable future." Elizabeth, always the most sensitive to emotional undercurrents, recognized the conversation had reached an impasse. "We just want you to keep an open mind, Mom," she said, smoothly changing the subject to Grace's upcoming school play. The discussion ended there, but I noticed the glances my children exchanged, a silent communication that excluded me and suggested this conversation was merely the opening round of a campaign rather than a concluded discussion. That night, after everyone had left, I walked through the quiet rooms of my home with new awareness. The house James and I had lovingly restored over decades had suddenly become contested territory. The restoration choices we had made together, prioritizing historical accuracy over convenience, craftsmanship over cost, preservation over modernization, were now being reframed as impractical indulgences. My deep knowledge of the home's systems and history was being subtly dismissed as sentimental attachment. For the first time since James's death, I felt truly alone, not just missing his physical presence, but missing his partnership in defending the principles and priorities we had shared. I sat in his study, surrounded by the books and papers that had defined his professional life, and tried to imagine what counsel he would offer in this situation. "Stand your ground, Maggie," I could almost hear him say. "You know this house better than anyone. You know what it means beyond its market value or square footage." Cut to scenes showing increasingly frequent, helpful interventions. Over the next several months, my children's strategy evolved from direct suggestion to a series of helpful interventions that incrementally undermined my autonomy and authority. Regarding my home, Catherine began sending real estate listings for condominiums and retirement communities, always preceded by comments like, "Just thought you might want to be aware of the options," or "No pressure, just keeping you informed about the market." The frequency increased from occasional emails to weekly updates, creating an underlying pressure to consider alternatives despite my clearly stated preference to remain in my home. Robert's approach involved regular financial discussions, often framed as helping organize Dad's estate, but inevitably circling back to the costs of maintaining the house. He created spreadsheets comparing my current expenses with projected costs in various alternative living arrangements, always structured to highlight the financial benefits of downsizing. When I pointed out that financial security wasn't my only consideration, he would respond with comments about making emotionally detached decisions and considering long-term financial health. Elizabeth's strategy was perhaps the most unsettling because it involved physical changes to my home without full consultation. What began as helpful maintenance evolved into unrequested modifications. She arranged for grab bars to be installed in bathrooms during what I thought was routine plumbing maintenance. She replaced the period-appropriate kitchen faucets with modern lever-handled fixtures while I was visiting a friend overnight. She had motion sensor lights installed along the staircase, eliminating the antique wall sconces James and I had carefully restored. "We're just making things safer and more convenient for you, Mom," she explained when I questioned these changes. "These modifications will help you age in place, which is what you said you wanted." The cumulative effect of these interventions was a growing sense that my home was being altered without my full consent, that my children viewed me as increasingly incapable of making appropriate decisions, and that my stated preferences were being acknowledged verbally but dismissed practically. Even more concerning was how they began involving my grandchildren in this campaign. Catherine's daughter Sophia mentioned during a visit that her mother had been researching which of my antiques would fit in a smaller living space. Robert's son William casually asked which items in the house I would want to keep when you move to a smaller place. Elizabeth's daughter Grace spoke excitedly about helping redesign my new home to incorporate favorite elements from the Victorian house once it's sold. These comments revealed that my children were discussing the eventual sale of my home as a foregone conclusion among themselves and with their children, despite my clear and repeated statements that I had no intention of moving. The narrative they were constructing, both within the family and apparently in their own minds, had no place for my actual preferences or decisions. 12 months after James's death, The anniversary of his passing became another opportunity for escalation. What I had planned as a quiet day of remembrance, a small gathering of close friends and family to share memories of James and perhaps work together on organizing more of his papers, was transformed without my consultation into a larger event with a distinctly different focus. Catherine called 2 weeks before the anniversary date. "Mom, we've been planning a special gathering to mark the first year," she announced. "We're inviting Dad's colleagues, neighbors, and some of his former students. Robert's handling the catering, and Elizabeth has a lovely idea for a memorial display." While their intentions seemed thoughtful, I was unsettled by the fact that this planning had occurred without my input for an event in my own home. "That's very kind, but I was thinking of something smaller and more intimate," I began. "Oh, we've already sent the invitations," Catherine replied dismissively. "About 40 people have confirmed they'll attend. It's important to honor Dad's academic legacy properly." When the day arrived, I discovered that what had been presented as a memorial gathering had an additional agenda. After the formal remembrances of James, Catherine clinked a glass to gain everyone's attention for what she announced as a family update. To his credit, the realtor gathered his materials quickly, murmuring apologies for the miscommunication as Catherine hastily showed him out. When the front door closed behind him, a heavy silence descended on the living room. The kind of silence that precedes irreversible change. "How dare you?" I said finally, my voice quiet but carrying the weight of profound betrayal. "How dare you bring a realtor into my home behind my back? How dare you discuss selling my property without my knowledge or consent? How dare you speak about me as if I were an incompetent obstacle rather than the legal owner of this house?" "Mom, please try to understand," Catherine began, her crisis management skills visibly engaging. "We're just exploring options at this stage. Nothing has been decided without you." "You were discussing asking prices and listing timelines," I countered. "You were describing me to a stranger as uncooperative and unable to appreciate my own best interests. Those go far beyond exploring options." Robert attempted his reasonable professor approach. "We're concerned about your future security, Mom. This house represents a significant asset that could be converted into funds for high-quality care as your needs change. We're trying to be proactive in planning rather than reactive in a crisis." "My future planning is my responsibility," I reminded him. "And there is no crisis except the one you three are manufacturing." Elizabeth, always the most emotionally perceptive, recognized the depth of my anger. "We should have involved you directly," she conceded. "But we were worried you'd reject any discussion of selling outright without considering the practical benefits. So instead you decided to pursue it secretly, presenting me with a fait accompli once arrangements were sufficiently advanced." I asked. "How exactly did you envision this proceeding? Was I to be informed of the sale only after you'd selected my suitable accommodation and found a buyer?" Their expressions, a mixture of guilt and frustrated determination, confirmed. This wasn't far from their actual intent. They had convinced themselves their ends justified these deceptive means, that their professional expertise in museum administration, economics, and design outweighed my right to determine my own living situation. "We love you, Mom," Catherine said, attempting to redirect the conversation toward emotional rather than ethical territory. "Everything we've done has been out of concern for your welfare." "If that were true," I replied, "you would have respected my clearly stated preference to remain in my home. You would have offered support that preserved my autonomy rather than undermining it. You would have approached me honestly rather than conspiring behind my back." I looked at each of them in turn. These 3 accomplished adults who had grown up in this very house, who had been raised with values of integrity and respect that seemed entirely absent from their current behavior. "I'd like you all to leave now," I said finally. "I need time to consider what this breach of trust means for our relationship going forward." "Mom, please," Elizabeth began, her artistic temperament always the most sensitive to emotional currents. "We should talk this through rather than letting it fester." "I've heard quite enough for today," I responded. "I've heard you discuss selling my home without my consent. I've heard you describe me as an obstacle to be managed. I've heard you make arrangements affecting my future without the basic courtesy of consultation. What I need now is not more talk, but solitude to process this betrayal." They left reluctantly, exchanging concerned glances and murmuring about calling me later, checking in tomorrow, giving me time to see the situation more clearly. Their departure brought not relief, but a profound silence filled with questions about how our family relationships had deteriorated to this point, and what, if anything, could be salvaged from the wreckage of trust they had created. That evening, sitting in James's study surrounded by the books and papers that had defined his academic life, I confronted the full implications of what had occurred. My children, those I had raised, educated, and launched into successful adult lives, had conspired to circumvent my authority regarding my own home. They had dismissed my preferences, disregarded my autonomy, and deceived me about their intentions. The foundation of mutual respect that I had always considered fundamental to our family relationships had been shattered by their actions. "What would you do, James?" I whispered to the empty chair where he had spent countless evenings grading papers or working on his research. The question hung unanswered in the book-lined room, but I could imagine his measured, thoughtful response. James had always valued integrity above convenience, principles above expedience. He would be deeply troubled by our children's deception, however well-intentioned they might claim their motives to be. As I contemplated my options, I realized that passive resistance would likely prove insufficient. My children had already demonstrated their willingness to proceed without my consent, to present me with decisions rather than include me in decision-making. They had established a narrative of my declining capability that would only strengthen, with time, potentially leading to more aggressive legal measures to override my authority regarding my own property. The thought that had been germinating in the back of my mind since discovering their secret meeting crystallized into sudden clarity. If I wanted to maintain control of my own future, I needed to take decisive action rather than merely defensive positions. And that action needed to be sufficiently unexpected to preclude the coordinated response my children had been perfecting